Welcome to the Melting Pod, stories about our dysfunctional immigration system and where we go from here. As your co-hosts, we've served inside the federal government for 2 decades and 4 presidents of both parties.
I'm Claire Trickler-McNulty, and I focus on ICE and immigration enforcement.
I'm Amanda Baran, and I work mostly on humanitarian-based immigration and immigrant women's issues.
I'm Doug Rand, and I focus on work-based immigration and U.S. citizenship. Every year, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services makes about 12 million highly consequential decisions that affect individual people's lives. People want to know, can I get a work permit? Can I get a green card? Can I get asylum protections? Even U.S. citizenship. And during normal times, this agency had normal government struggles. Lots of agencies struggle with how to deliver service fairly and on time, how to make a giant bureaucracy more efficient, how to adapt to the inevitable surprises that history delivers. But under Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0, this agency, USCIS, that's dedicated to serving our nation of immigrants, has become weaponized against immigrants. And today we're going to talk about how this happened and where we go from here.
And we have a really, really fun guest here today. I worked with him a lot when I was in the administration. Sometimes I would call him my nemesis a little bit. My frenemy, Michael Valverde.
You weren't the only one.
Michael has been or was at the agency for a really, really long time, and he has had a lot of jobs. I'm going to let him introduce himself and talk about himself a little bit, but I want to say that Michael's one of the funniest people I met at USCIS. He never failed to make me laugh. So, Michael, welcome.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I would just say one of the last memories I have of working with Amanda was that she made fun of the potato chips I was eating. And I thought it was good-natured, but now I'm rethinking that there is animus behind this.
There's never animus. There's never animus, Michael.
Just business.
Yeah, just business.
What kind of potato chips were they?
The best.
That were macaroni.
The best kind. They were jalapeno.
Potato chips are delicious. Amanda,
why would I make fun of that? I eat them myself.
And iced tea.
It was the brand? Was it a bad brand?
I thought you were going to say they're the blues, because I do make fun of people who eat those. They're like the blue and the purple and the orange chips. Like who wants to eat that?
Or the Doritos?
On flights. I like to eat those on flights.
Yeah. Well, I know on flights is different because you can't choose.
They're the ones made from turnips, like the fun ones.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They deserve to be. All right. Common ground.
Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get involved in immigration? Let's take it way back.
Way back. Yeah. So hi, happy to be on the show. My name is Michael, and I was a USCIS lifer until about a year ago. I started back in 97, back in INS days.
INS. Oh, sorry, Michael. I totally neglected to tell you, one of the most important principles of the Melting Pot is we have a strict no acronym rule. So what is INS?
To support that wholly. My career started with the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1997. And then I was there, as with so many other colleagues who are still there, when USCIS's doors opened in 2003 and up until last year, I made it. How did I get there? I'm kind of a nerd in this way, in many ways. But in this way, I always thought immigration was fascinating. And I tried to study it in undergraduate, but no one really knew how to have an immigration program. So I had a Latin American studies degree with government as my concentration. And then in grad school, someone wrote a book about immigration. So I went to grad school in Delaware to study with the author who wrote that book. And I wrote my thesis on naturalization. And then I said, I will either work at the State Department or at INS, or I'll just go on and have my life, wherever. And INS came. So that's way back, I guess. So there you go.
So how did you ruthlessly work your way up the civil servant corridors of power?
Climbed the ladder till middle management. I was hired in Washington, D.C., which was a great advantage. So I started, halfway up there in a policy office doing adjustment of status policy. Learned a lot of lessons.
Sorry, adjustment of status to normal people is green cards.
Yeah. So where people will apply to get their green cards to stay permanently and work freely in the U.S. Temporary protected status officer for 4 or 5 years. My claim to fame was it went from being this tiny program, and then the Hurricane Mitch cohort happened in 1998 and 1999. And that was when I was coordinating the TPS program, and I was there for the expansion of that. And it really just wended my way through international affairs. I did adoptions, went to Vietnam, and there was a big to-do with Vietnamese adoptions. I was assigned to London for 2 years to work with the UK British agency. So that was like an amazing experience to see how they tackled some of the same problems. I was always amazed that, every problem they had that looked like ours had 3 less zeros at the end of it. It was just such a smaller problem set. And then came back and really found my way into refugees for a minute, and then USCIS field operations, where, to make a long story less long, the last 10 years of my career were in USCIS field operations, which is, where they do green card decision-making, where they do citizenship decision-making and citizenship ceremonies, and then a bunch of other things. But that's the long story of my immigration journey. And now I'm coping with life being outside of the agency for about 12 months.
Well, you've been in like every nook and cranny of that agency, it feels like.
Yeah, I felt like at the end of it, I knew how it worked. I knew its culture. I knew its people. When you spend a lot of time with an organization and you sort of grow up in it, you have heroes. When I was growing up in INS, there were these very tall men with big mustaches, and one by one, they all retired. And the last 3 or 4 years, I would look around the table and I'd say, oh crap, that's like, I'm the big guy with the mustache now, even though genetically I can't achieve that. But you know what I mean? You get there and you just find yourself there. But yeah, I guess I'll start with vulnerability, but I love the agency. I love its mission. I really thought I found my place. I mean, I really did find my place there.
So I have to ask, and you might not want to answer, but why did you leave then?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I left during the DOGE stuff, right? The environment wasn't great, but the DOGE offers were really good. There was some early retirement benefits, and I had put in my time sufficiently so I can get health insurance, right? I can get that kind of retirement. But, more fundamentally, the agency changed, right? And, I believe and have been through enough administrations, as you all have too, that to the victors go the spoils, and it's their prerogative to make changes, right or wrong, good or bad. But it really changed, right? The organization was about to change. Its mission was changing. And you're a civil servant to make the politicals effective. And I took the opportunity to step aside and give that chance to someone else, because that wasn't where my heart was.
You hung up your mustache.
If only.
I think we should pause to note that for our legions of brand new listeners, Amanda, Claire, and I also spent time in this agency at USCIS, an agency I think we all love and whose mission we feel really connected to. We were all political appointees, so when the time was up, the time was up. That's just expected. But it's not expected for the place to become intolerable for civil servants. So that's a great injustice that we'll be talking about later in the episode.
I think most people, when you think of government, if you think of it at all, think that Congress gives agencies money to run. That's why there are all these like budget things happening in Congress all the time. And the government's not funded. The government's funded. Parts of it are funded. USCIS escapes that a lot because the vast majority of USCIS is funded by user fees. When you go and apply for citizenship, you pay a fee for that. And it's supposed to either cover the full cost of the adjudication, or sometimes, like for citizenship, we think it's such an important benefit that we figure out a way to subsidize it with other fees so that people can access it better. And it makes it a little different from other agencies. There's a small part of USCIS that is funded by the government that has to do with E-Verify, which is a system that allows employers to check whether or not someone is able to work legally. And we could have a whole episode on E-Verify and how effective it is.
Please let's not.
How effective / ineffective it is. But I do think that's something that is unique about the agency to mention.
Yeah. And it's a lot of money, right? I mean, Michael, when you started, it was probably not that much money, right? But last I checked, it was what, like a $6 billion budget?
Yeah, it's a $6 billion budget. I mean, I think that is something that its day of reckoning is going to come at some point, right? Because I don't know if fees have exceeded inflation, by 100% or 1,000%, but the fees just continue to grow. And that's because there's not a lot of accountability. So the people who set the fees, career people, look across the work and say, we have to take these steps we have to rent these buildings or buy these buildings. We have to pay these people, and we expect to get this many people to apply for them. And there's math, and then there's fees, but they just have been climbing and climbing and climbing. At a certain point, they're going to price people out, or I'm sure they already have priced people out, but it's not surprising that the fees will grow because there's no one with authority saying, hey, is this too much? And the righteous discussion about that would be then what shouldn't we do? Like, what nice things shouldn't we have? If fees are important, and I think they're going to be, they're so expensive, to do a family, to get your green card, it's like $6,000 for a family of 3 till you get all your fees. And if you want to have attorneys, it's this car purchase of an event. And, some people say it's important. We should expect people to put their money where their mouth is, but it's really going to price people out if it hasn't already.
I could just dig in a little bit on this too, because I think we've mentioned this on other podcasts, but this gets at the heart of the term immigration benefits, which is used a lot, right? You are benefiting somebody by getting a status, but broadly, that's something that people are paying for. They're applying for it and paying for it, right?
Right. You don't pay for food stamps.
Yeah, it gets people confused that like things are just being handed out.
No, 100%. I'll say it this way. The speech that I've given over and over again, when you're a fancy pants field operations SES person, you go to a lot of naturalization ceremonies.
Wait, what's an SES?
Senior executive service, when you're the boss.
The top civil servant.
When you're the boss. Yeah, that's embarrassing to say. But yes, I got to go to a lot of naturalization ceremonies, and the speech that I would give always started with a thank you to the new citizens, right? And then I would unpack it. Immigration law, as explained to me back in the day, is to benefit U.S. citizens, right? We should get smarter. We should be more prosperous. We should be safer if the immigration law is administered correctly, right? Because if we do immigration law correctly, very real tangible things happen. Like my retirement funds get fuller. My chance at having an actual Social Security in the future get better because there are more people working and putting money in. If we do immigration law right, we're the beneficiaries, born U.S. citizens, people who naturalize, people who are here. And I think that sort of nuance is lost in the, tough versus nice debate that we have these days.
I love that. And I love that you say that at naturalization ceremonies.
So I would say, thank you. You are making me richer, right? And then people would laugh because that sounds like a funny joke, but it's a real thing, right? And
it's
it makes my life richer. Like I don't know, that's a cliche, right? But whatever business they start, whatever friends my friends have in school, and they have, unique and different experiences, life's better, right? And so if we do that right, that's how it should be, but we're just not there yet.
That's going to be a clip. We're going to clip that.
And that's my speech about user fees.
But Michael, let's be clear. There's no way that Congress could possibly afford to appropriate huge sums of money to a component of DHS. That would be unthinkable.
Absolutely. Something as big as $6 billion is like real money.
Claire, how much money does ICE have on an annualized basis now?
It's insane. Let's just say that they just got $45 billion for detention alone. So,
Yeah. If Congress wanted to, without, it would be a rounding error in the federal budget to make citizenship free to apply for, or to make a lot of things free to apply for, but they don't.
So I really appreciated hearing all your history and how you've obviously done a lot of things in this area, but I think it might be helpful for the audience to go way back and to understand what is the trajectory of immigration.
When I joined, for shorthand's sake, it was about 30 years, a little less. For the first third of that experience, even including September 11th, immigration was rarely in the headlines, right? There'd be every now and again something big, but immigration was something that isn't like today, right? And what I saw over the course of my career was it slowly becoming more and more politicized, or more and more important politically. The agency became an agency, right? It left the Department of Justice. That's where the Immigration and Naturalization Service was. And after September 11th, there was legislation that took the immigration pieces from the Department of Justice and created USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, created ICE and Customs and Border Protection as 3 distinct agencies. In the early 2000s, USCIS was 7,000 people, something like that. It has really grown to where it's now 20, 21,000. So it about tripled, but it never became such a massive bureaucracy where you still couldn't get things done relatively quickly, except for rulemaking. Sorry, Amanda.
A question I've gotten a lot, and I don't know the answer to, and maybe you do, is To what extent is USCIS right now using AI to make decisions, do other things? I think there's a lot of fear out there that AI could be used or misused.
Yeah. So, with all transparency, my knowledge stops about a year ago, but I think if there had been a 2.0 or whatever, we would have heard about it. So I will answer with some level of confidence and say there's not much. There's not much AI. We were working on and had in place some policies and processes and tools that would allow us to identify documents, set a birth certificate or a driver's license, and put them in the right file so our officers could do that, could check that. But there was nothing where I think a lot of people think, I've had people at conferences and other places come and be very adamant to me that this exists, where someone's entire application and file was put into an AI tool and decisions were written that were mailed to them that were an AI product. I don't think that exists. I think Navy officers on their own are using their desktop Gemini to ask some questions and give them some language. But, institutionally, process-wise, there's very little AI.
USCIS, while it is probably the biggest dog in the immigration system, it's not the only one. And I'm just talking about the legal immigration system here. So we're not talking about ICE, you're not talking about the immigration courts. USCIS doesn't decide if you're allowed to get on a plane and come to the United States. That's the State Department. USCIS is not the ones that tell you if you're allowed to leave the airport or cross a border. That's CBP. USCIS really serves people who are already here and who need permission to do something in the immigration system. Okay, Michael, the USCIS touches a lot of people. I mean, there's tens of millions of naturalized citizens in the United States. So a pretty healthy chunk of the US population has at some point had contact with this agency and seen the course of their life kind of determined by this agency or those they love. So let's get into the myth busting section of this interview. Imagine someone files a green card application. Walk us through the black box. What happens to this application from the moment it gets to the loading dock? Where is the loading dock? And then what is its journey over the course of months or years to an approval notice in someone's mailbox?
And please use the word lockbox.
Please use the word lockbox, just like Al Gore.
Fuzzy math. All right. Where's the beef, Doug? You ask for it. So that's the other thing about being a fancy senior executive. You make jokes like that in meetings and there are 22-year-olds who have no idea. And you say, where's the beef? I think the funniest part is at the very start, right? Because there's not much funny about the rest. But people work really hard. Let's pretend it's an EB-5 and the acronym's there. Employment-based fifth person. That's if you make an investment of $800,000 or a lot more and create a number of jobs, you can apply for a green card, right? Some shortcut there to get through that explanation. But there is a lot of paperwork that is required to prepare to file that application because USCIS is sitting there waiting for it. They're going to look at your economic plans. They're going to look at everything that has to do with that investment, where the money came from. The stacks of paper that come into the facility that receives it, Doug, that's called a lockbox, which are Treasury-run facilities or Treasury contracted facilities that were
run by JP Morgan.
Yeah, run by banks. Originally were really just people to take the money. The Immigration and Naturalization Service wasn't good at depositing the checks timely, right? You had to do it within 48 hours or something like that. And smart people learned that there are these other people who supported IRS and other government agencies called banks that had these things called lockboxes. So we bought some of them. Since then, it's become its own industry where they have people who are doing some data entry. They've got USCIS people on site making some decisions about fee waivers. They are the ones who help us with technology. They have some of the biggest scanning machines I've ever seen in my life. So that's become an industry. But the funny part is, so think again about
the funny part.
It's probably not funny, but your employment-based fifth preference, they work on their laptops. They get their economists, do these thousands and thousands, sometimes 10,000 page PDF documents that they print out, they put in boxes and they send to the lockbox. The lockbox loading dock, as you mentioned, gets them off trucks, takes them into facilities and they scan them in. And so this poor paper document exists for about 48 hours or as long as it takes FedEx to deliver it, and then it's destroyed. So that is the introductory question, the introductory story that I tell about how a bill becomes a law, how an application becomes a green card. It is this thing where it starts with this paper process, except for the paper only lives for about 48 hours because we have
Michael, hold on. So I'm a green card applicant. You're saying I hire like a lawyer and they're working on a computer. The application runs to thousands of pages, but it's a PDF. But because USCIS at this point doesn't accept it electronically, my lawyer has to print it out, this giant thing that weighs dozens of pounds, ship it to the lockbox, where the first thing that happens is the lockbox scans it back into a PDF.
Yeah, shreds it.
I thought I heard a rumor, more than a rumor, while I was there, that these applications in particular, while they were in existence as giant stacks of paper, were making the floor sag with their weight.
Yes.
And creating like occupational hazards for the people who had to lift them.
Yeah, 100%. They injured employees. There's a secondary scanning contractor that was bought so that we could avoid those problems, so they could scan them in and we could work with them in their PDF, in the electronic environment. So, that's probably a lot of words wasted to say that's the start and state of the technology that someone has to interface with USCIS. The agency, in whatever year this is, has not figured out really resilient ways to accept things electronically, right? And that has, over the course of the last 20 years, been something the agency's really struggled with.
Okay, so our brave little application has made it past the lockbox.
Made it past the lockbox. It's scanned at the lockbox and put into any number of USCIS electronic workflow systems. So the agency has made progress over the years and can deal on many levels and in many application types with a completely digital record. So that was really good on the inside for the employees adjudicating the cases. After the lockbox, though, there's a bunch of parallel track things, right? So when they are put into a system, the system is now smart enough to begin sending the applicant's information to the FBI and to some other places for background checks, and to collect that and to format them if anything comes back in a way, and send them to the people who get to review that information and determine next steps. At the same time, for a green card application, the application is moving to a person who's not a USCIS employee, but a contractor, and they are doing checklist work, right? They say that these pieces of paper, the medical file, the documentation that shows that the sponsor can financially support them is in there and it has the right information. And so they go sort of grimly down this checklist and make sure that everything that needs to be there is. And if it isn't, they'll do the correspondence right then and there and say, hey, you need to send us this piece of paper. It's missing a birth certificate or missing marriage certificate. And at the same time, like I said, there's this parallel track where any security or other sort of related information is being assembled and reviewed. And ideally, they'll converge at a human decision maker who'll make a decision.
That's the immigration officer.
That's the immigration officer. What happens before that is it goes, if it's a paper file, it goes to a warehouse. If it's an electric file, it goes into a queue somewhere and it sits, right? And that's the processing time, right? All these steps that I just described, right? Like the human doing the checklist, the instantaneous background check stuff just takes, days, not much time at all. But volume and people who can do the work, volume and the number of those contract employees means that since more work comes in than the hours of the human that can do it, is most green cards have this flurry of activity in their first 48 hours. They're born, they're printed out, they're scanned in, background checks happen, maybe a checklist review happens, and then they wait. Right? They just sit for whatever the processing time is. So if you go onto the agency website and it says its processing time is 13.5 months, 13 months of that is just waiting, right? It's not like there are smart people rubbing their chin for 13 months saying, what should I do with Amanda's green card? It's just waiting, right? It's that has been the USCIS that I've known forever, is there's more work tasks, and I say that because I think we own the decision of what we assign the people to do, but there's more work as we make it than there are people to do it, more hours of work than there are people to do the hours. So there's just these incredibly long wait times. Like in what world is a 6-month wait reasonable? And I know it's not what we're talking about, but that's like so much of the processing time is waiting.
Right.
Yeah.
So now this little brave application has been sitting in its virtual or physical queue for umpteen months, and it finally gets to a human immigration officer who dusts it off and looks at it. And so now what happens?
Generically, the immigration officer has about an hour to look over the results of the security checks, to look through the file and make a decision, right? Apply the facts to the law. It's the facts to their
There's like 1,000-page application,
Well,
and the officer has an hour to...
So if it's one of the types that is really massive, then they have more time, like 4 to 6 hours for some of the massive ones. But if you get to that stage in your career, and more senior officers often get some of the more complicated and more dense types, the kind of person who succeeds in that environment is really good at moving through a document. They're really good at looking on systems and zeroing in on the data points that they need. They have a method, right? They're not the newest officers who's struggling to understand things. They're good at it. But yeah, it's still a rush, right? Even if you have a 300-page document and you have 4 hours to go through it, that's still not a lot, right? It's still not a lot of time. But yeah, they do it. If you're going to be getting your green card because of your marriage to a U.S. citizen, it's like an hour, and it grows from there depending on complexity.
So you've waited 6-12 months to get an hour of the officer's time, and then what happens?
Yeah, and it could be an interview as well, and that's part of the hour. So for that U.S. citizen spouse and their applicants for the green card, they'll come in and they'll be asked questions about what's on their application, what happened between the time when they filed their application and today. So the sort of processing time creates its own work in that way. They will be asked about their relationship, or if they're getting their green card based on some other provision of law, they'll be asked about that. And provided it all works, they'll be told thank you. Some offices say you're approved today. Other offices just say we'll tell you in a few days. And if they are approved, then they'll get a green card in the mail. There's a bunch of technology between hitting the approved button and getting the green card, and then you go, and then you're done, and then you're off into the world.
Mike, you talked earlier about how there's some cases that require interviews and some that don't. And I'm just curious what you think about the interview process itself and whether it's helpful. Like, why do we do it for some cases and not for others?
I've spent about 10 years thinking about that. I have very few epiphanies, but I'll share what I know. The first thing I'll say is we do ourselves a disservice because we talk very sternly and seriously about the value of the interview. And it can be a super valuable tool, that's be pedantic about to get verbal testimony from an applicant for an immigration benefit. But we portray it sometimes like the USCIS immigration officers are human lie detectors. And we portray it like it is a security layer, right? And fair enough, looking someone in the eye, maybe you get a sense of whether they're being truthful to you in a way that not having the ability to look them in the eye does. But I think we've emphasized that such that people have come into the office of both parties, but generally more when there's a Republican administration. And if they're security enforcement minded, a viable tool is to ramp up interviews. And like I said, I just think we've done ourselves a disservice by exaggerating how much a human can tell from another human. But to answer your question more directly, the interview is a powerful tool, right? Those officers that I described that know their way around will tell stories like, on paper, this relationship looked crazy, right? Maybe there was a religious difference, maybe there was an age difference, maybe they weren't living together, but then they'll come in and he'll touch her arm and she'll look at him and they'll be like, okay, this is a good relationship. And that won't be the end of the interview. They'll go through their steps, but that physical appearance, that showing up and talking will really make a difference. So it can. What I thought the job that I had, like the value that I could add is I asked the smart people to do it. Like when you're the boss, you don't do anything. You ask the smart people to do it. So the smart people built some analysis that said, hey, we've been interviewing for decades now. And for 2 or 3 years, we had electronic records of every interview we did and every fact about them that's on an application. And they did the analysis and said, here are cases where the interview seemed to matter. And here are cases where the interview had no impact on the ultimate decision. And then we did a double blind test. And sure enough, in 98% of the time, the first interview was correct. And the other 2% were when the people just didn't show up for the interview and they got denied. So they would have been approved, but they never showed up. So we built this methodology for making sure an interview as a resource, as getting that verbal testimony from an applicant was most valuable. And I think that's, to lengthily answer the question, I think that's the value of the interview. And that's what the agency was really working hard at when I was there.
I remember walking in the door and seeing all that work and thinking, this is terrific. And I think the political team trying to really help implement that. And it did create a lot more efficiency and it did conserve resources where they were most needed. And then what happened immediately after the new administration came in?
The first Trump administration came in and said, we're going to interview everyone. It is a security measure. How can we give people the right to exist in the United States permanently, work in the economy without actually seeing them? the big change there was that people who were applying for the green cards based on their employment went from mostly not being interviewed to 100% being interviewed. Now, to give credit where credit's due, we did that for 2.5 years and we got that data. And in the last days of the first Trump administration, we convinced them, showing the data, that maybe we could go back and we could have this rules-based interview criteria for those employments. So the arc since the second Trump administration, they're back on we think interviews at this layer of security.
We try to ask good faith questions here, even though, of course, we don't hide our partisanship. But in your experience, what's the worst that could happen? Well, actually, I think you probably know the answer because you were there during COVID, right? Like, what happens if you don't do interviews? What happens if you stop doing interviews? Like, what's the worst that could happen if USCIS doesn't interview people and does all the national security checks, all the criminal database checks, which happen electronically, all the behind the scenes evaluation of applications? What's the worst that could happen? And I don't mean it facetiously. Like, tell us what's the worst thing you've seen that an interview caught at the last second.
The results that I saw, we catch and we at USCIS use that language like catch, but we're certainly not police and we didn't ever put handcuffs on anyone. But the cases that we were able to deny for the real national security issues, the real bad criminal issues, we don't want this person to be our neighbor. I won't say 100% of the time, because I'm sure there are a handful of times when this happened, but we're largely always caught through the background checks, right? Through the electronic systems checks. The things that were caught in interviews were marriage fraud schemes, right? And so we would, as an agency, every year find a bunch of different marriage fraud schemes. There was one in the Dallas and Houston area, and there was hundreds of people, and there was a ring, and it happened because of an interview. That's the value that the interviews added for sort of relationship-based cases. Where there was fraud on the relationship, talking to people and seeing them in that relationship is really helpful. Where there is criminal and other issues, the interview didn't often result in a, unsolicited confession about, yes, I am spying. And, thank you for asking me. It's been such a hard weight on my shoulders. It was, it's more like the marriage fraud stuff. I always thought it argued for, let's interview the cases where there's value to the interview. And let's not think that the interview is this lie detector test, this X-ray machine, because we have some great interviewers, but they're just people asking questions.
So, Mike, you talked about the FBI and all these other background checks. Like, what other layers are there for security and vetting?
Sure. So my experience, again, with the Immigration Naturalization Service going forward, I started at the same time as Congress released this report on something that I don't expect anyone listening to know about, but it was called Citizenship USA. And it happened, in the 90s. And part of it was about background checks. And so at the time, the background checks were fingerprint cards. Applicants would go to their drugstore or wherever and get their fingerprints rolled with ink on this card, and they would send in the cards with their applications, right? So there's no identity check, there's no oversight. And, surprise, surprise, anyone with a criminal record would have their friend without a criminal record do the fingerprints, and they would send in. And what the Citizenship USA was this big audit, and they found all of this fraud, and that was one piece of it. The other piece was sometimes the agency would get the fingerprints, and maybe they were legitimate fingerprints. And the process was we would fax them to the FBI at the time.
Fax fingerprints?
We would fax the fingerprint card to the FBI. And the important thing about that is we gave them 30 days to respond. And if there was no response, we would go ahead with approving the case. And what happened in the 90s was, I think there was citizenship drives for the election, and there was a lot more volume, and FBI couldn't keep up, and no one was really speaking to each other, and the FBI wasn't able to give responses within that 30-day period. And we would go check the system or the fax bin, and there'd be no response, and we'd go ahead. And again, another one of the Citizenship USA audits was all of these people got citizenship who had disqualifying criminal issues or issues that the agency should have looked into, should have asked them about. So I'll start there as that was the INS that I joined. And then a few years later, 9/11 happened. So background checks had been really important, and getting them right and layering them in and being, as a selfish, self-preservation bureaucrat, being able to say, we've done everything. We've asked every question. We have every piece of information, and we made the decision based on that. as opposed to, what happened in Citizenship USA, when we thought we asked and we didn't wait, or 9/11, nobody was talking to each other and some guy over there had some information and someone over here didn't. And so that's been the culture of USCIS, right? Where the agency is very stern about background checks and integrity, right? We would create our own directorate mission and vision statements, and we would say which one word is the most important to you, and integrity was always, 10 times more important than the next word. And that's because of the culture of the agency is all about background checks. Democrats or Republicans, irrespective of that divide, that's really important to the culture of the agency. So, with that as the background, the agency that I know is entrepreneurial in that they're always trying to find more data to run the applicant's information against, right? And so FBI is a good clearinghouse for domestic criminal information, right? And more over time, they're looking at some of the overseas information that some other people are collecting. So beyond the FBI, they're looking at some more intelligent-based information and looking at which laws and rules enable us to look at what, and which laws and rules prevent the agency from looking at information collected by some of the intelligence agencies. So it's, like I said, very entrepreneurial. The more information that the agency can get and lawfully review before they make a decision, they're going to constantly be trying to acquire that.
It feels to me like, adding more and more and more security checks. You have the very exciting 48 hours, then the 12 to 18 months of languishing, then the 1 hour. And then after that, security check hole that people go into must account for some of that backlog.
The criminal databases, whatever databases that we check, the results come back and they're being worked pretty quickly. Now, if the results are dense or hard, then you're right. The analysis of those results can take forever. Sometimes there's information that is in a classified place. Sometimes there's information that requires talking to law enforcement officials and either getting permission or getting understanding of what that information is. And those are human tasks. And there aren't many people at the agency that are super good at that.
Going back to our brave little application, if all the national security and criminal databases get pinged, comes back clear, then the application's on its way and goes through the process we just talked about. But if anything comes back with a red flag, now it's shunted into a totally different queue, right? And that could take a lot of extra time. And the ultimate outcome could be, false alarm, back in the regular queue you go, or it could be, something more serious. But like you said, Amanda, it kind of can be a black hole for people. And I don't think the agency has necessarily sorted out how to distinguish false alarms from real threats as efficiently as possible.
No, that's correct. I mean, there's a whole field of trying to determine if the information pertains to the applicant. And the scope of the challenge, right? When I was the new employee at INS, I was stopped leaving work one day by one of the cleaners. And he said, I don't know why he picked me, right? As a busy lobby, I had kind eyes at that day, I guess. And he said, I have a naturalization application that has been pending for 5 years. Can you help me? Right? He's just like the cleaner at the headquarters of the immigration agency. And I said, sure. What's your name? And he said, his name is Mohammed Mohammed. Just think of that. If there was a hit, if someone with that name, right? Or maybe his name could have been, like Jose Mendez, right? There's just so many people with the same name. And that's the scope of the challenge. And, we come at it from a perspective of it's better to go slow and not miss than it is to go fast and open the aperture of risk to miss, right? And so someone was probably going through a list of 500 Mohammed Mohammeds or 500 Jose Hernandezes and making sure that the birth dates match or they don't match and making sure that the addresses are right and deciding if this potentially derogatory information relates to this person. So yes, to your point, the way that the background checks are set, the fidelity is fuzzy so they can make sure they don't miss anything. But that requires a lot of analysis on the human side to make sure that the matches are real.
Democrats and Republicans don't want to play fast and loose with national security. It's important to take this seriously. However, there's a trade-off. Having to make this poor man who happened to be named Mohammed Mohammed wait 5 years means that if there was a Mohammed Mohammed or a Doug Rand or a what have you, who actually meant to do Americans harm, when these national security backlogs get out of control, then what we're really saying is, in our zeal to leave no stone unturned, we're going to take longer to vet everybody.
I think, yes. The premise is that we're going to take a little longer on everyone's cases in order to not make those mistakes.
5 years is not a little longer.
Yes, it's a real cost on the gentleman who worked at the INS building. Real human cost. Should he get approved, he could then petition for his family, and maybe his family's waiting for that, right? Real human costs. The values of the agency have really been, as I've known them, though that's the trade-off. We go slow in order not to make that mistake. If there is a real Mohammed Mohammed out there, and I should have chosen a Michael Valverde name because I feel bad using Mohammed Mohammed, but if there's a real bad guy out there, there are other people, again, with badges and guns looking for that person, right? The fact that we may or may not have information that we could share with that law enforcement agency, I always thought was the most important thing USCIS could do, right? If we're doing a background check on Doug Rand and we find out that that's the Doug Rand that the FBI has been looking for, then, we're going to save the day by sharing your latest address with some law enforcement people.
That's important, of course. I mean, I guess at the same time, I think reasonable minds could agree that the agency needs better technology tools, so it can be fast and careful at the same time. We don't want innocent people to languish, and we also don't want dangerous people to go undetected because USCIS has all their human experts doing this lower value manual work.
So we talked about background checks, FBI criminal checks, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on social media vetting, like if it should be used, how it can be used in a way that respects First Amendment rights, what the role is, and if it's changing.
Yeah. So I can say, one of my roles in the department, in the agency in the Obama years was there was an incident in Southern California, and there had been some posts on social media before the incident. I think someone shot some coworkers, but they had posted about it beforehand. And that caused the agency to want to look into social media. And I was assigned to develop that. And, the technology at the time, and I don't think we've gotten too much further, wasn't great. Right. There was no tool out there that said, okay, USCIS applicant, give us your social media handles. You couldn't sort of automatically screen it and say, here are the 3 things you should look at in the Doug Rand, Instagram account. Right. We didn't have it. It was super manual. That's what we learned. And so we developed a process, a very manual process. We worked with the civil rights people to make sure that it was appropriate and lawful and constitutional. But it was really not helpful, right? It was really a time suck. We used it on a targeted basis, right? So the typical process was you had an application, and if something in it made the officer think that social media was going to be useful, you assigned it to them. So that was sort of the normal green card generic case. And there are a handful of people who had a Facebook account and pictures of their vacation with their not spouse, and that made for some uncomfortable green card interviews. That was the result. At the same time, the agency was struggling with how to do Syrian refugee processing. And social media was seen as, well, can we say that we're doing that, right? That would be like an additional layer of vetting. So again, that was the first time that I remember that they put every case of a certain type through social media vetting. But again, it's very manual. And I don't know that a lot of came out of it. I remember looking at some printouts, and the state of the technology, the state of the review were, by the time it would get to me, it was a piece of paper that printed out a picture from someone's social media in black and white most of the time. And sometime with script of a language, Arabic script that no one could figure out. So a lot of words for me to say. The early days of social media were not really effective. So that was the Obama years. It really continued since. And up until I left, I wasn't aware that they had really any better tools. They had better tools at spotting social media, but it was still a super manual review. Yeah, at USCIS, like an interview or social media, you want to get things that help you make a decision on a case. I don't think we got a lot out of it.
Well, it's also a lot of it's subjective, right? Like something that someone posts on social media, doesn't necessarily mean they, endorse it, or maybe it's something that someone finds, like I'll take an example, like Free Palestine, right? So Free Palestine to me is, I want a free Palestine, but to someone else, it may come off as something more threatening and might set off alarm bells. And there's no guardrails around something like that. And that's just one example, but there's so many examples like that of someone posting something and maybe someone else without guardrails thinking that this is terrorism or, this person's going to harm the United States.
No, I think there are 2 lanes there, right? And there's the speech lane, right? And we can, I'm sure, have a whole conversation about using the word Palestine and the way that the State Department terminated visas and targeted people because of speech issues, right? That should be one set, right? And being the wonky civil servant, like if it's not useful to me to make a case decision, then yeah, I mean, are you a hunter holding a machine gun, which happens in Texas a lot, I understand, right? Or other parts of the country. Or are you a freedom fighter holding a machine gun? Like, to the subjective nature, I don't know how you get there. I mean, I guess it gives us, again, a question to ask someone in an interview. Hey, we saw this picture. Maybe you clicked, I never received military training, but here's a picture of you in camouflage holding a machine gun. That's as best as I think we got on it, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember seeing a picture of Lauren Boebert holding a machine gun, I think with her family in front of a Christmas tree, right? Like, so,
yeah.
How is that
that's her
okay?
right
But
as
if you're from Afghanistan, there are other alarm bells that
Right,
go
if you're
off.
wearing the wrong kind of scarf, you
Right,
get in trouble for that.
Right.
No, I just think it's a really difficult piece of information to use. And we don't have the right tools to do it en masse anyhow.
Michael, how many people would you estimate are working full-time at USCIS just on social media vetting right now?
Well, I would think it's grown since I've left, but I would guess in the different offices across the country, there's a handful of people that were trained. So 50, 70, 100. And then at headquarters, there were probably that same number again.
200 people?
I would guess. And I would think that number's only growing because, again, I think this administration's focus on things like social media and everything else means that they want to grow that capacity.
200 people is not a handful. 200 people who could all be doing something to actually reduce backlogs and something that adds value to the mission is remarkable. And there's one more thing I think we need to add for our listeners. The incident that Michael talked about earlier with the horrible shooting in San Bernardino in 2015 exploded into controversy after a front page New York Times story said that one of the shooters was approved for a fiancé visa to come to the United States, even though, quote, she talked openly on social media about her views on violent jihad. She said she supported it and she said she wanted to be a part of it, end quote. It later emerged that, in fact, she'd only said these things on private messaging platforms so that no amount of social media screening could have caught them. In fact, the then executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, quote, this was a really big mistake. And more than anything, since I've become an editor, it does make me think we need to do something about how we handle anonymous sources, adding, this was a system failure that we have to fix.
So one thing we didn't talk about, which I think really should, I don't know if it will, but should define where the agency goes and could answer to some extent some of the questions about efficiencies and backlogs and security and vetting is starting way back several administrations ago. Obama can claim credit, or even before that, they can claim credit, is something called continuous vetting. What continuous vetting is, right, is what it sounds like. The vetting of an individual who is not a citizen, or the laws say what data you can screen against who, depending on what status they have. Continuous vetting is they're running it every day, right? And so again, if Michael Valverde is a green card holder and I do something that makes me removable, a light goes off somewhere in Claire's old office and the good people at Immigration and Customs Enforcement can make a decision what to do with me. Up until and continuing till today, because continuous vetting isn't universal yet, USCIS does its vetting like at a point in time way, right? So Doug Rand files for his green card, we vet him, and all clear, he is given a green card. It's the next day, he robs a bank. There's a bit of chase going on, right? It has to come to ICE's attention. Right. And there's ways of doing that. And I'm sure it happens in an automated way, but continuous vetting could be something, if universally done, that we get the information instantaneously. We can make our decisions. Law enforcement has the right piece of information. They can come to us and ask for Doug Rand's address. And B, people could be ready to be vetted and get their benefits even before they come to us. So the minute someone comes at USCIS, they're in the US. So the minute someone applies to us, if they've entered the US, we're continuously vetting them. We know green or red. I think the systems could be built where a lot of the work is sort of waiting and we could fix some of the backlog issues and some of the lengthy processing time issues.
We can be faster and safer. And again, I'll be the one to point out that we're going backwards for no good reason right now, because so many times in the past year and a half, the Trump administration has announced, despite having continuous vetting, all this national security theater, like, we're going to make people come in for fingerprints like way more times. Or, a work permit used to last 5 years. Now it's only going to last, a year and a half because we have to make sure people apply. But you just gave the lie to that, right? Like, If someone robs a bank, we're going to find out. We don't have to wait a year and a half. We don't have to wait 5 years. We're going to find out today, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's going to be a key to, whatever the next version of USCIS is, it's got to rely on that, because that is the first place that sort of solves both the process quality, process security, and process efficiency issue, right? And everybody at the agency, and I think everyone who thinks about the agency wants good decisions, wants righteous decisions. And something like that is got to be the building block. So I'm very hopeful, anyway, that sort of clear-eyed people will get their hands on that and say, this is a tool that allows us to stop doing repetitive things.
I guess I want to get your perspective on one other thing. I talked to a lot of people about what we should do with the system and what the future should look like for immigration. And sometimes they'll just say things like, eliminate the asylum backlogs or eliminate this backlog. And my view is, if it was that easy to just do it, it would have been done. But I know we talked about Doug's little green card application making its way and getting stuck, but why are there such big backlogs? Why have different administrations not been able to clear them?
Yeah, that first premise is like, why don't we just fix that problem? Is magic wand.
Why don't we just are some of the most ill-advised words in the English language? Because whatever comes out, I'm guilty of this all the time. The words that come after "why don't you just" are going to be very irritating to anyone who's actually doing work.
So self-aware, Doug.
Lesson for new politicals at an agency is you're going to ask a lot of questions like that because you're coming in, and the person in front of you is going to feel embarrassed because they're going to sound like a bureaucrat, like the worst version of a bureaucrat, when they sigh and say, well, there are a lot of reasons why we can't. But I think it's a good question. I think the agency has a lot of tools, but the backlog issue at USCIS, I will say there is something to be said just about prioritization and focus. My last high five accomplishment was that we eliminated the naturalization backlog for about 10 minutes in like 24 or something like that.
No, give yourself more credit. You got it down from like a crazy backlog to a 5-month median wait time. Yeah. We naturalized 3.5 million people in 4 years, which is higher than any other 4-year period. So kudos to you, Michael.
No, it was a big deal. I'm proud of it. I one of the things I did before I left government was I took all the big numbers of every year I was in charge, and I decided that we naturalized the populations of Seattle and Boston combined, and I felt good about that.
That's awesome.
Those are big cities. So backlogs, right? The bureaucrat will always say there's more work than there are people, so we need more people. But maybe we also need to look at our processes and think about how to work differently, right? That's certainly part of the answer, maybe most of the answer. But the magic about backlogs really starts with focus and priority. Someone who I worked for told me, and I didn't believe them until I saw it happen, is that when you have a backlog reduction program, it starts when you say it. When I said, because the math started looking like it was possible, we're going to eliminate this backlog by Christmas or whatever I said, it sounded like a bold leadership promise, but the math was there. The backlog reduction started before we took any extra effort to do it. We didn't add overtime. We didn't fix a process. People just saw that it was focus. People saw that it was a priority, and it started going down. And then all the good work that we tried to do with the interview waivers and making hours available that weren't used on other tasks, it was like a snowball rolling. So it can be done, but it's about, I think, priority. Ultimately, that was one backlog among many. And so there is a choice about prioritization.
Can you tell us, and I'm sorry to go back to something that's, I'm sure, very painful, but it's something you lived through directly. The rest of us who care about you and your colleagues saw unfolding in the beginning of 2025. Because you were there for the Trump 1.0 transition and you were there for the Trump 2.0 transition. Can you tell us what was different the second time?
Yeah, they were very different. The first transition was a transition like I hadn't seen before, because some of the people that were picked to be part of the transition team that ultimately ended up running big parts of the agency were people that had worked there and people that sort of knew how, they had opinions about policy and what we should do, but they knew our ways. And, I remember when some of them were hired into an office that I was at, I felt like I was senior to them in some ways, but they came in and they were people that we worked with. And like I said, they had an ambitious policy agenda, although it was kind of random. I saw it. Trump 2.0, first difference was, the policy agenda was much more ambitious and much more organized. But the big difference, and I think what you're asking about, is their attitude to the employees. It seemed like the leadership had bought into the deep state narrative, and it felt like an us versus them environment. The individuals that came as part of the new leadership did not express that. There were, personnel reassignments that took people out of their neighborhoods and sent them to several states over and gave them short periods to decide if they wanted to do that or not. I woke up one morning and had an email that reassigned me to the Department of Homeland Security to some science and technology job that, that my resume didn't prepare me for. And I felt like I couldn't figure out why that happened. That was reversed. So I'm not the victim in that one. But there was a lot of just, it's the DOGE and all of that. So yeah, the whole dynamic with being part of the federal workforce was awful. And we got those emails that, fork in the road, 2 sentences that said you should retire and become more efficient in the private sector. So it was really awful. And then at the same time, all the political stuff that I think there have been articles about. A lot of my colleagues, not ever me, thank goodness, had to go and do lie detector tests and were asked questions like, have you ever broken any laws in your life ever? And then 6 hours later, they would emerge from their lie detector experience. And so just unprecedented, right? The workforce didn't know what was going to happen. They thought the agency could be, can I use RIF? Reduced in force was the acronym.
Yeah.
Like
Firing,
USAID
layoffs.
did. Yeah, they thought they're going to come into work and not have a job on Friday and be told to leave. There's all sorts of just unfortunate and harmful misinformation or intentional sort of vagueness and unclarity and fear. So yeah, I would not be more dramatic than that.
Intentional fear.
Yeah.
But during COVID, you had built this agency where people could work remotely. And lots of people, after the agency learned how to work remotely, took the option they were given to work remotely and move to a different state, move to be near a sick parent, move to where their kids had better medical care, what have you. And then overnight, they were all told, no, sorry, you have to report to an in-person office that could be hours and hours and hours away. And it ruined people's lives. There was no reason.
I think I said at the very start, the job changed. I mean, I spent so much of my last 4 or 5 months there talking about where to house is not the right word, but where to put people who were driving from the choices that they made to move out into the world to their closest USCIS facility, right? And so all of a sudden in Baltimore, they needed a room for 50 people who were coming, who had moved to, New Jersey or wherever, or Delaware, to go into the Baltimore office because that was the closest, right? And what they would do there is sit there and open up their laptop and do their job just in the same way that they had been doing in their home office. So yeah, that was super disruptive. And again, just the mission of the agency just changed overnight.
How would you describe the new mission of the agency?
They've been very transparent, right? The very first message we got from leadership was, right, if you remember, I'm sure you do, 2025, they came and it was about removals, right? They were going to deport 1 million people or 1,000 a day or whatever that metric was. And our directive was there's nothing more important than supporting our colleagues at ICE, right? And ICE came and said, we need 800 detailees. And here's where we need them. And the discussion started. And time after time, the feedback was, I would do my duty and say, well, we have 10 people in that office. ICE wants 6 of them. They'd be like, make 6 available. And, I don't know how that ever ended up, but that was the number one priority. And that's why I said at the start, I had the luxury of taking them up on the deal and leaving the agency because that wasn't the mission I wanted to be part of. I liked, efficiency, granting benefits, doing national programs of that nature. And it was clear that that was not going to be the 4 years.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that they're trying to take employees who are funded by fees that people are paying for an adjudication of their application to go support ICE's mission, right?
Right. I mean, they would make these deals where ICE would reimburse USCIS so that it was all, I guess, compliant. But you're right, they would remove large chunks of the immigration benefits processing capability to support the removal operations. That was clear. And they were upfront about it, very transparent. And that was our number one priority, is to support that.
And I just want to point out that the backlogs at USCIS, at least in recent history, they shot up during COVID. And then the Biden administration tried to bring them back down with some success, although not complete success. And now they're shooting up again in the total absence of COVID, in part because, like you're talking about, Michael, hundreds of people are being told to either go work for ICE or do useless make work, social media vetting, or what have you, which leaves far fewer people to actually do the work. And the ones who are left to do the work are being told to redo the work from the Biden administration because of made up allegations that it wasn't done right the first time. And so everyone's just going to wait and wait and wait and wait, or worse, get denied for no good reason. So on that happy note,
I was just saying that working with you politicals is an art that I feel like I have to teach. Like when the next election comes, I'm going to have a secret weekend. Hopefully our deck, we're going to get a new deck, will be built, and I will invite them I'll invite all the senior executives to my deck and say, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be all these crazy people who are going to ask you, why don't we just? And you're going to feel like a big bureaucratic jerk because you say, well, because, that breaks 7 laws and 14 regulations. And it's a problem that, your predecessors and all that bureaucratic sounding stuff. And then the next 4 years happen and you juggle, sorry, this is starting to sound mean-spirited, but you juggle many different priorities for many different people who are often asking you to use the same hour of time in 47 different ways. So I could go on, but I think there's some art in that interaction between politicals and the career leadership that should be studied and best practices built. Sometimes I think the job of the career leader is to build a resilient agency despite the political leadership, while at the same time pleasing the political leadership because they won the election, they have their objectives, they set the policy. But sometimes the policy feels short-term and destructive. And that's the difficulty of the job, right? You have to try to build this long-term enterprise that's going to be good and evergreen when you have these shifts of priority.
Well, I'll say that sometimes I think the workforce needs to build a little resilience themselves when it comes to hearing that stuff. That was a huge point of contention when we were trying to undo one of those decisions. I don't remember which one it was, but us saying that they made a wrong decision. Oh my God. I mean, the number of freaking emails, the number of conversations we had to have about a change that we had to make. And oh my God, you're hurting the feelings of the people who wrote the thing. And I'm like, put your big girl panties on. Like, I have got my feelings hurt many times about lots of things. Like, let's all move on with our lives. And like, we're all adults here. Like, give me a freaking break.
No, I think that's CS culture is very, no, I agree. It's funny that we're having this conversation because we all have different faces depending on who we're facing. I got much better at saying, we need to do this, end of discussion. USCIS will have endless discussions about everything.
Yes.
And feelings will be heard.
Yes.
But yeah, I take your point. I take your point.
2 careers were like, yeah, you guys come on and you guys do all the stuff and we just wait until you get tired. And we watch you get tired because you do so many things and then we take over. I thought that was
Have you ever heard the term weebie? No? Nobody's heard? I guess this is from other agencies. Civil servants refer to themselves as weebies, as in, we be here long after you be gone.
Nice. If you all showed up and said, here are the 100 things that we need to do in order, that would be great, right? And obviously that can't happen and politics happen and life happens. But right, like I think we're all ready to support and I think we're smart enough to know our role. But man, the organization and the priority building it's always a challenge because it's politics and it's live action.
But we haven't talked about SES politics. That's a whole other episode. Bonus content people will pay for.
Oh my God, let's pay for that. I would love to end on your wonderful speech, about how you make us richer and not because you're giving us thousands of dollars in fees, but because immigrants' contributions make our country richer. I love that.
I know. So I'll say this one thing then, but the opportunity is that folks who do come in the next administration, I guess Democrat or Republican, are more steady-handed and they do approach the problem of USCIS with this opportunity statement in mind that if we do the work right, even with the existing laws, we emerge with a stronger country, we emerge with a safer country. It's a national benefit and it's a national good. And if we can start with that as the premise that we're doing each other and ourselves a favor by being really good at what USCIS does, I think then we can reposition it. Rebuild it sounds very dramatic, but we can rebuild it into something that adds that value for real.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really well said. And thank you for your lifetime of service, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Not dead yet.
Not lifetime.
Right. Sorry. Damn. Yeah, I should have said career. Making the country stronger and safer and more prosperous and more humane. And we hope you have many
your career of
opportunities to continue
service.
doing that.
You are my favorite frenemy.
That's right.
Amanda, I know you mean that nicely, but it sounds so underhanded.
No, I do mean it. I love Mike. Mike knows that. Thanks for melting down with us today. You can follow and subscribe to The Melting Pod wherever you get your podcasts. Our website is meltingpod.org, and you can find us on YouTube and Instagram. Drop us a line with any questions and let us know how we can improve the show. And you can check the show notes for organizations that are working hard to make our immigration system more sane and humane and that deserve your support. Until we melt again.